Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this broadcast on this lovely evening. My name is Adi from Sabah, Malaysia, and I will be your host for tonight. I hope that everyone is doing fine and always keeps everything clean. The Jesselton Philharmonic Orchestra. I hope that everyone is in good health and high spirit until the end of this long lockdown. For Zoom attendee, please help us to answer a series of questions when the polling pop up. For more info, please go to our JPO Facebook, Instagram, Twitter page, and don't forget to press the like and follow button. If you have any question, please write it down at the Q&A below, or for a YouTube live viewer, type it out at the comment section. JPO are very honored to be able to invite the Sirius String Quartet from New York as our special guest for tonight. With today's topic, improvisation and multi-genre, how does shape our personality as 21st century musician? Sirius String Quartet, an internationally acclaimed veterans of contemporary music, the quartet combines exhilarating repertoire with unequal improvisational fire. This conservatory-trained performer-composer shine with precision, soul, and a raw energy rarely witnessed on stage, championing a forward-thinking, genre-defying approach that makes labels like new music sound tame. Since their debut concert at the original Knitting Factory in New York City, Sirius has played some of the most important venues in the world, including Lincoln Center Ellis Tully Hall, the Beijing Music Festival, the Cologne Music Trinelle, Stuttgart Jazz Music Actual in Canada, the Taichung Jazz Fest, Taiwan's biggest jazz event, and many others. Having premiered works by significant living composers, Sirius continues their long-running commitment to musical innovation with bold, original works by its own members, pushing beyond the conventional vocabulary of string instruments by incorporating popular songs form, extended technique, gripping improvisation, and an undeniable contemporary grooves. As educator, the quartet has given lectures, masterclasses, and workshops in universities, conservatories, public schools in both the US, Europe, and Malaysia. Among them, University of Maryland, Virginia Tech, Munich Conservatory, Lubeck Conservatory, University Science Malaysia, and many more. Without further ado, let us invite the Serious String Quartet for the interview. Hello, everyone. How are you?
Good.
Great.
Hi. Hi, Adi.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
Hi.
Oh,
I see that Mr. Gregor doesn't haven't unmuted his mic yet. Yeah.
Okay, now I
Okay.
do.
Hello. Hello. Okay. Please introduce yourself to the audience. Let's start with the first violin.
Hi, my name is Fong Chen Hui. I'm originally from KL,
Oh, wow.
Kapong to be specific.
Hello.
Yeah,
Hai,
I've
apa
been
kabar?
living. Oh yeah, I've been living in New York for the past 16 years.
I see. What about the next violinist?
Yes, I'm Gregor Hubner. I'm living in New York since about 25 years now. I was born in Germany and studied there before I came here to New York. And I'm with the quartet about more than 15 years now, actually.
I see. What about the violist?
I'm Ron Lawrence, and
Hello there,
I'm
Ron.
actually an original member of the quartet, which dates back to the 1980s. And I'm from the Midwest, which is in the middle of the United States, but I've been living in New York for 40 years, pretty much. Yikes.
All right. Let's move on to the cellist.
Yes. Hello. My name's Jeremy Harmon.
All right.
I am also from the Midwest. I grew up in Kansas City in the very middle of the United States, but was born in Canada, actually, in Nova Scotia. And I currently live in Boston. I'm the one member of the group that is not based in New York. And I have lived up in Boston for about 15 years, and I've been in the quartet for about 10 years. I'm the newest member of the quartet, but we've been playing together for a while now.
All right. So let us start with a series of questions for each of you. Now let's start with Chernhui. So Sirius Quartet is a string quartet in standard formation, two violins, a viola, and a cello. But as far as I can see, your repertoire does not consist of standard classical pieces. Instead, they are mostly newly composed. Um, and composed by yourself and leaning heavily on improvisation. Could you please explain to the audience what is improvisation?
Well, improvisation is a very old, very ancient art form, probably the first art form ever in music, which is creating music spontaneously without
Mhm.
any notations, um, which is something that we are all capable to do, but we kind of forget because we get our more sophisticated music training after we took up a violin class or piano class when we're young, and yeah, improvisation is a way that we look inside ourselves and trust our intuitions to create music on the spot. Yeah, I would explain it that way.
I see. All right. Another question for you. How did you discover improvisation?
For me, started I started improvising when I was still studying in UPM in the music department.
Mhm.
I had quite a few friends who were who are jazz musicians, or they were leaning more to jazz. And also there was Dr. Chan who's still in UPM now teaching there. Yeah, they started. I would say they started me off with improvisation, and from there on, I started to realize, improvisation is a lot bigger than jazz itself, and especially after I moved to New York, I got in touch with all these different musical traditions, and I got to learn some of those music as well. So it became a very big world for me, and since then I never stopped improvising.
I see. So what about the rest? Let's go for Gregor. How
Yes.
do you discover improvisation?
Well, I grew up with it. My father
Mhm.
or my grandfather came from Eastern Europe, from the Czech Republic, and he was
Mhm.
first violin in a gypsy orchestra. So when I was young with my grandfather together, we played violin without looking at music. So it was kind of improvising around some, gypsy tunes and stuff. But then my father was the first one who studied classical music in our family. So I had both sides. I started without music, and then I got into reading music, and so it was kind of natural to me to go into jazz improvisation later in my, studies. That's how. But it was something normal. I didn't ever thought it's something you're not doing.
Mhm. So you started with classical, is it?
Well, I started with gypsy music actually, with my
Gypsy music.
grandfather, on the violin. We played around songs and stuff like that. And then later,
Mhm.
of course, later is I was 6 years old when I started with classical music, of course. But so improvisation, I'm just saying improvisation was not something unnatural to me. It was just at the same time I started reading classical music, I already improvised. So I never thought of it as something special because it was always there.
Interesting. All right. Let's move on to Jeremy. How do you discover improvisation?
So for me, also it happened pretty early on.
Mhm.
So like Gregor, I also come from I'm lucky to come from a musical family. My father was a professional jazz guitarist, and as jazz improvisation is a huge part of jazz, and so I heard him improvising from basically from the time I was born. I wasn't particularly interested in jazz as a kid, mainly because I just sort of saw that as my dad's music. I mean, I respected it, but that wasn't really my thing. Um, so
Mhm.
I played piano as a kid, and I think I would start playing around and coming up with little things on my own on piano. But for me, it was really when I got a little bit older, let's say maybe 11 or 12, and I had been playing cello for a few years already, but I had started playing electric guitar, and that's really what kind of turned me on to a lot of different things, among them improvising and writing my own music. And so the entry point for me was more rock music. So I listened to a lot of classic rock as a kid, and a lot of hard rock and metal and stuff like that. And so for me, I just absolutely fell in love with playing guitar and started improvising on the guitar. And then as I got a little bit older and a little bit better as a cellist, I started to incorporate ideas from guitar onto cello and started improvising more with cello. And then it kind of all sort of mixed together for me as I got older.
All right, let's move on to Ron. How did you discover improvisation?
I think I might have had the most strict, straight up classical music education of the four of us, actually. And so I spent my early years, as a violinist before I switched to violist, as basically reading music. That's what music was for me, reading music. It wasn't listening to myself, or it was very much almost an I dominated thing. And what took me out of that was, first of all, as a teenager, like Jeremy, I got influenced by rock and roll, and I'd go to these free outdoor rock and roll concerts in the park in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in the late 1960s, and hear tremendous bands, and there would be these wonderful guitarists taking these wild, long improvisational solos. Like, wow, that is so cool. That was my first thought. And then when a little bit later, I had the opportunity of playing in a community-based African drumming ensemble run by this wonderful Ghanaian musician, Abraham Adzenia. And that was completely a folkloric tradition that was orally taught. And that really opened my mind to a whole nother world of possibilities. That's sort of how I got off the page, in that way.
I see. Okay, so Ron, as the eldest member in the group and the only original member, could you please tell us about how Sirius Quartet musical direction has changed through the years? Did it begin with a lot of improvisation in the repertoire?
The group has evolved, because every time you add a new member, it changes the whole dynamic of the group. But the group was never a string quartet in the traditional sense of playing Beethoven and Mozart and exploring, or even exploring more modern standard quartet repertoire. The group grew out of a group called the Dave Soldier Electric String Quartet, which was sort of the house band string quartet for a performance space called the Knitting Factory, which was down in the Lower East Side, Manhattan, in the 1980s and early 90s. And that our purpose there was to interact with other composers in that club, and people would just come to us and say, I got this idea. And some of them were classically trained at certain levels, but a lot of them were just like, I want it to sound like this. And they'd play some stuff on the guitar and we'd sort of figure out how to play it, the group has become, as it is now, we've got 3 tremendously well-trained composers in the group, and they write compositions for the group. But it was always the quartet was a vehicle for interacting with composers, either within the group or composers outside the group, and collaborating and doing new music. That's always been sort of the purpose of it.
All right. So another question for you, Ron. What was your musical influence growing up, and how do you find it relevant to what you do today as a musician?
Oh, well, I think I'm just an omnivore in life generally.
I see.
So I'm always open to whatever's around me. I want to listen to new things. I want to hear new things. I want to eat new food from different cultures. I want to listen to music from different cultures. So it's just sort of, I guess, who I am to a certain extent, my musical, the African drumming ensemble I described was really opened me up to getting off the page, and I think the other thing that I got from that and from other groups I've worked with is that music is the classical pedagogy is very much that you spend a lot of time by yourself in a room, sort of learning technique, learning how to physically get the instrument to cooperate with you. But that's only a very what I realized from that African drumming group and other groups I've played with is that music is really about community and enjoyment and a shared experience. And, you know, I got that from the African drumming people. I also started playing with Latin bands when I came to New York. And I saw that the music, that music in particular, was the salsa that we were playing was for dancing. And the dancing and the food and the party, they were all integral. They were part of the musical experience, you know? And so that's a wonderful, joyous thing to be able to participate in.
I see. All right. Let's move on to Mr. Gregor. All right, Gregor, you are a professor at Munich Conservatory of Music. What do you teach there?
I teach composition in the jazz department of the school. Even though it's composition, I kind of created this position over the years. It's like composition in general, actually. I teach like, yeah, from classical to jazz, everything, you know. I try to open it up without borders. So I'm teaching composition to the students. I normally get master students. After they did their bachelor, they can study with me for 2 years.
Okay. Growing up in Germany, how important was classical training to you?
Oh, it was very important. I mean, the classical tradition in Germany, of course, is like very high. And I was lucky I could study my first 2 years of my college was in Vienna. And Vienna is one of the most greatest university for classical music, but also one of the most conservative. I learned a lot, but I didn't like it, so I moved on to Stuttgart in Germany, where I studied with the Melos Quartet, and the Melos Quartet was at the time, one of the most known quartets in the world, and they played with all the great people, and the tradition was very high, you know, the classical tradition was there, so it was always there, and I studied that with them.
I see. All right. What would you recommend young people to take their classical training seriously? Not literally like your Sirius Quartet name. Seriously, even though they would like to pursue jazz or other kinds of music in the future.
Well, the thing is, you have to differentiate that, because with the violin, for example, the violin is an instrument. The string instruments are instruments which are developed in classical music. Technically, you know, the technique on these instruments is developed in classical music. Now, I highly recommend to study classical music and to learn these techniques through classical music on these instruments. But if you compare it to the saxophone, for example, the saxophone is mostly developed in jazz. So if a saxophone player asks me that, I would say, you can start in jazz. You can start all your development in jazz. That doesn't work for strings. You know, there's not enough repertoire in string jazz or like schools or like something like that. So you have to really go through the classical music training, I think.
All right, let's move on to Jeremy. So, Jeremy, are you there?
I'm here. Yep.
All right. So, what was your musical influence growing up?
So I think I touched a little bit on this initially when I introduced myself, but just to reiterate, was lucky to grow up with musician parents. So my father was a jazz guitarist, so I grew up hearing jazz a lot. As I said, I didn't get strongly interested in jazz until I got a little bit older, until maybe I was a teenager, 16, 17 years old. But I think growing up around it all the time was a big influence on me. My mother was also a pianist and a singer. My father was also a singer. In fact, he was actually training to be a classical baritone, like an opera singer, until he decided to switch gears and study jazz guitar. So already I was, kind of in a family where there was a lot of appreciation for different styles of music. For me, growing up, listened to a lot of rock music, blues, metal, hip hop, Um, some classical music, but honestly, I would have to say as a kid, I enjoyed playing classical music more than I enjoyed listening to it. There were some exceptions, and that started to change as I got older. But yeah, I didn't. I wasn't somebody that would just sit around listening to classical music all the time. There were a few pieces that really piqued my interest, and as I said, I always loved playing it. But I started to appreciate it as a listener more when I got older. So yeah, for me, I always felt like, especially as a teenager, I had kind of two different musical identities. So I had, kind of my classical side where I was taking cello lessons and playing in orchestra and playing in string quartet, and I was really serious about that and really loved it. But I also spent a lot of time playing electric guitar, and I had several bands growing up that I played in. And I would say I spent as much time doing that, or maybe even more time doing that. And I can remember times when I was in high school where I'd play an orchestra concert and I'd be wearing my suit, my tuxedo, and then I'd rush over to like a rock club afterwards. And I remember playing a couple of shows in these like tiny little rock clubs in my tuxedo because I didn't have time to change in between. So I'd say that kind of would sum up my teenage years pretty well as far as my relationship to music goes.
Right. To our viewers right now, if you have any question, please write it down at the Q&A below, or for YouTube live viewer, type it out at the comment section. Okay, Jeremy. Some people would see the more aggressive genre of music as being harmful to young people. What is your view on that?
That's a really interesting question. I would say, first of all, if we're just talking about music,
Mhm.
uh, music being organized sound, I don't personally believe that sound in and of itself can be harmful. In terms of music, I don't think it's innately uh, helpful or harmful. It's really, I think, depends on the intent of the artist and the composer. And for myself, I was always drawn to a lot of music that was probably could be seen by a lot of people as being more aggressive or more extreme. Um, and there was something about the intensity, especially of metal and like hard rock music, that really appealed to me. Um, and not really because I was an aggressive person. I don't consider myself an aggressive person, but something in that music really resonated with me. And music for me, always from a very young age, has not only helped me celebrate positive moments in my life, but it's also helped me deal with emotions that are harder to process, darker emotions, sadness, anger, depression, fear, things like that. And I think if you look to the classical music canon, uh, I think you can hear a lot of really aggressive classical music. You can hear music that expresses a whole range of emotion. But if I think particularly to music like Rite of Spring by Stravinsky or some of Shostakovich's music, in
Mhm.
which he was processing his own uh, difficult life living under the fascist regime of Stalin in Russia. Music can be used in so many different ways. So yeah, so no, I don't believe that aggressive genres of music are inherently harmful to young people. I would say the opposite. Having a creative outlet to express all of your emotions is extremely healthy, and I would say necessary.
All right. Okay, so for everyone, I'm gonna ask you a question. Any of you can answer this. As you might know, most audience members tonight are young classical musicians. Improvisation means spontaneously creating music without the help of written notes. How does it help classical musicians to develop their musicianship?
Can I take this?
Yeah, sure.
Go for it.
Okay. For me, growing up as a classical musician who vaguely realized the existence of improvisation, but still
Mhm.
largely playing written music, um, I felt that when I finally started playing improvised music, or improvising in general, um, it gave me a very different point of view of how to interpret a piece of music. Of course, this realization came afterwards, but without me knowing it, music flows a lot more natural for me when I look at a piece of music. For example, a piece by Mozart, for example. Instead of thinking hard what the composer wants, because I'm already improvising, which means I'm already creating music myself, I kind of understood what goes through in the composer's mind, even though, of course, I'm not the same composer as Mozart or other people. But but I understood the logic in it. And so when I play a piece of music, there are certain things that that comes very naturally after I started learning how to improvise, and I think that really helped my musical development. Also, going off the page, as we say, taking a solo, um, playing an improvised piece of music completely without notes, really stimulates your brain, your mind to come up with something new instead of just focusing on something that is already written and you're just reinterpreting it. Um, and that really opens up, another department of your mind. And I think that alone is very worth exploring for musicians. And plus, improvisation is a long tradition, had been a long tradition in classical music as well, before they were called classical music. Um, the cadenzas and concerti and sonatas, they were meant for improvisation. As some of you might know, Bach and Beethoven, they were great improvisers. There are historical records of them improvising. Beethoven even drove some guy out of town because they had a showdown. They were improvising. They were each playing a solo, and that guy said, "If Beethoven's solo is better than mine, I'm going to leave Vienna." And of course Beethoven's solo was better than his, so he had to leave. He had to keep his words. So that was a true story, true historical story. So as you can see, up till the 19th century, there's still people who improvise a lot. But slowly, composer started to take over the task of musicians, creating the music partly for them. So there are more and more control in the composer's side, and the musicians are just becoming more and more passive, and that's how things become what it is today. We are only learning whatever's on the page, which is good. We need to learn how to read and interpret music on the page, but at the same time, we need to develop the other part of our psyche as well. So to understand that tradition, to understand improvisation is also a way to understand classical music uh, in a very indirect sort of way. Yeah.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, sure.
The thing is, not when normally young classical musicians are afraid of improvisation. Why is that? Because today, I think they affiliate improvisation with jazz. So if they hear improvisation, they think it must be jazz, but it's not actually. You get them when we teach. We try to get them where they are at the moment. For example, when they play a Bach solo sonata or something, you can improvise with that, or you play a Bartok sonata, you can improvise with that kind of language. You already know, when they play these pieces, they know this language. They're just afraid to use it freely. And that's the thing where you can get them to improvise, in their own language. And me as a composer also, I'm using a lot of improvisation in my pieces. But it's always in the language of the piece. It's never asked, to improvise in a jazz style or something in the middle of a classical piece. That's not what it is. It's improvisation is like a part of the music in the moment, and it doesn't have to do with any style of music. And that's what people don't know and think. They always put improvisation in a certain corner. And I think we try to get that out of this corner.
Yeah, can I say, I agree with that completely. I think the skills that you use in improvisation are not like some strange island off the coast of the violin playing or of string playing. They totally converge and give you a better understanding of the classical tradition. You know, if you think about the classical tradition, like our Eleanor Rigby arrangement, he was referring to Bartók with that first little Romanian dances, with that first little intro that Gregor wrote for the for that piece. And that's exactly what Bartók himself was doing. He was going out in the field, listening to folkloric music, people who weren't from an oral tradition, and he was incorporating that into the classical tradition. And that's always been happening. Mozart was the same way. If you travel in the Alps in Austria, up into the upland Alps, you go to these little towns where there's barely even a road to them, and in the fall they have a beer festival, and they wear these little felt hats with feathers in them, and they play clarinets, and they have a tuba or some kind of bass instrument like a tuba. And this is exactly what Mozart was using to write the Mozart divertimentos. You know, so it's all of a converging river flowing downstream, and all these skills that you learn by attempting to improvise, by getting off the page, they could totally inform your classical playing in terms of the difference between, if you were to play a Mozart or play Bartók, you're going to use your bow in a different way. You know, ideally, you want to have it so that, and starting to improvise really shows you, especially in different styles from different cultures, really gives you an idea of that there's much more for string playing to embrace than simply correct playing, you know, of like a Mozart piece, because there's this huge palette of sounds you can make. There's a whole world out there and improvisation is a way to enter that world.
All right. Thank you for the answer. It's very interesting from three of you. Okay, Gregor, we understand
Yeah.
that you go to music conservatories, university, public school, and music camp to teach string players about improvisation. Could you please share with us how should we start improvising?
Okay, I mean there are different things. You know, you have the harmonic side, you have the rhythmic side. So we normally start very basic. We just take a scale, like let's say D minor or something, you know, and trying to explore the scale by improvisation. So everybody needs to know that scale, but normally that's a given, you know, these kids normally know the scale. So we play the scale together, and then we try to improvise in that sound of the scale. And I think that's not done in classical music. You know, the thing is, you learn a scale, you learn all the fingerings and how to play it over 3 octaves and stuff, and as fast as possible, but you never think about the notes you're playing. And that's the thing where you have to start to think about the notes you're playing. How does, like, for example, how does the E sound next to the D? That's a very interesting note. Nobody thinks about that. Because if you play a solo then, later, that E could be the beginning of your phrase. And then you have an interesting note starting that phrase. And that's what people need to, you have to open their mind for these kind of things. And that's very basic. And then after that, you add some rhythmical stuff. Maybe you add some changes over the time. But that's how we start to develop this kind of hearing. You have to train the hearing. You know, you have to train your ear to hear the sound. And I mean, as a string player, you only play one note at a time, so it's very hard to hear a sound of the scale. On the piano, it's easy. You put all the notes at the same time down, and then you hear the sound of the scale. So you have to find a way to create that. Of course, in the workshop, you have more string players, so you can create that sound. And that's it's more like an ear training actually than just playing what you know. So that's the start of it, and then it develops in many different ways. It can go to many different, like I said, rhythmically, harmonically. It depends also on the level of the students, of course. If we have very basic students, it's different than if you have people who already know how to improvise.
See. Okay. Chenwei,
Yes.
serious quartet music often mix genre together and the different influence within and out of the piece. What is
Yeah.
your approach when you play different types of music? Is it important for young musician to know all kind of musical style?
Um. Yeah. This is a question that that I would love to answer the most because um right now 80% of my income is through playing non-classical music. So uh, I think, yes, I think it is important for young musicians to know different genres. I wouldn't say all genres
Mhm.
because it's impossible to know all genres, but I think one should really learn uh, something about the genres outside of their own major genre. Like if you're a classical musician or a jazz musician, you should learn something about rock, I would say, or know something about hip hop. You should listen to some of the stuff, at least know how it sounds like. And because in our day and age, playing classical music to make a living is not very sufficient, not really enough. Of course, there are some people who can still do that. Um, but for most people, for I would say 70% or even 80% of the musicians around, once in a while they would have to play in a context that is non-classical, being a recording session for a pop musician or concert, concert artist for rock music, concert for rock artists. There are so many different things that people do these days to make a living. I'm sure you have done quite a few of that yourself. So
Mhm.
I think that's something that is very important. Now, when I say knowing some of the styles, what does that mean? Does that mean you have to know it completely like a pro? Uh, Not necessarily, and it's also quite impossible to know all the genres that you can touch on that completely. But at least you have to be faithful to that genre. You have to respect the genre. In my case, I'm very interested in, other than jazz, I'm very interested in tango, Argentinian tango, which I know a lot of classical musicians love to play. Um, but how do we play tango? How do we bow? How do we use the bow? How do we phrase? How do we express with our phrasing? They actually they sound very different from classical music. When you play it correctly, it's actually very different from the normal way that we play classical music. So for me, I would listen to a lot of that kind of music, just to copy the style until it comes in naturally when I play, so that it's a default mode. When I play a certain style of music, I will have a certain sound. So another example is rock music. Like when you saw the video that you broadcasted before our
Mhm.
my solo in Illinois Rigby, that was a completely different sound. If you play with that kind of sound in classical music, you would consider it wrong, correct?
Mhm.
Because it's completely out of context. But because when I'm playing this piece, I'm faithful to the genre of the music that it's written in. It sounds correct. It sounds just right. So I think to hear to listen to the music and hear the context and play with the context, play into the context, is more important uh, in this sense, about when it comes to playing different types of genre. So I think listening is a very, very important keyword here. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for the answer. Okay, this question is for the quartet. What do you think is the future prospect of improvisation and multi-genre playing in music conservatories? What are your wishes?
I can answer this one, or I can
Yeah,
start at
sure.
least. Well, so first of all, I think, having played in this quartet, as I said, for about 10 years, and the other guys even longer, and having spent a lot of time with students at various levels, um, in various parts of the world, I think we've definitely seen that this approach to playing string instruments is growing, and I think it's going to continue to grow, because I think as human beings, we're curious about what other humans are doing, and that's definitely always been the case in the art world. And art and music are always being constantly influenced by other art forms, and I think so. I think this is continuing to grow, and I think you see that some conservatories are starting to acknowledge this and try to create space for this way of playing in their schools and in their programs. And we've been really lucky to work at schools and universities that some of which have these programs already established, others that may not have these programs established, but they're really looking to branch out. And I definitely see that in the vast majority of students that we work with, a curiosity, even if they're very talented classical musicians, and even if that, apologize, my kids are
Please,
crying in the
don't worry
background,
about it.
so sorry.
They're improvising.
Um, they're
Yes,
improvising. Yeah,
improvising.
that's right. They're definitely improvising. But I'm always struck by the curiosity in students, and I myself am a cello teacher, and spend almost every day working with mostly middle and high school students, and almost all of them I spend some time working on improvisation, and some of them are more interested than others, but they all gain something from doing this. Whether it's something even as simple as just getting better acquainted with how to play their major and minor scales. That's one thing that I've consistently heard from all of my students that I work with on improvisation, is that they learn their scales better because they're not just playing them up and down in one way. They're learning the ins and outs. They're taking the scale apart and putting it back together, and things like that. So, yeah, I think it's growing, and we, of course, hope that it continues to grow.
All right. So before we move on to Q&A, uh, one question for our organization. So Jesselton Philharmonic Orchestra is an organization with limited funding and doing activities like outreach program and somehow like this broadcast. What advice would you give to us beside organizing concerts, workshop, and music camp?
Maybe I take over for a sec.
Yeah,
I
sure.
said that it's great to have an organization like that for young students, young kids to do this, and camps and orchestra concerts and stuff. I would add one more thing, and because it's very successful done here in New York, I think, with the group Face the Music. If you want to check that out, it's called Face the Music, and that's like an orchestra just devoted to living composers, playing music of living composers. And I think that's great because you can work with a composer together. I taught them at one point too. You work with a composer together who created the piece, and that's a very different experience than normally kids have in this kind of camps and organizations. You know, they play music of composers who are long gone, and
Mhm.
to work with a composer is a really interesting experience. I think that would be something great to add to the program.
All right, thank you. Now let's move on to the Q&A session. Yeah. Uh, an attendee from the Zoom have a question for you guys. What conservatory or music college you all prefer to music students in the US? For example, Manhattan, Juilliard, and so on.
Well, can I take this?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Um, Regretfully, this is one question that my parents never asked when I grew up. So I went to a school that nobody knows. I went to a school called Aaron Copland School of Music in Queens, New York. Um, all jokes aside, I think it's actually a very big answer. It's a big question with a big answer. Um, if I really want to simplify my answer, I would say it really depends on what you're looking for. in a school, and also what does your child, what does your kid want to study? I think that's very important. So every school or university has a very different uh, music program, and they are all focusing on different things. For example, my school, even though I learned violin performance there, but it's also a very strong school in music theory. It's one of the strongest music theory schools in North America. Um, and it's a community college, Queen's College. So and the fees is very low compared to all other music schools in New York City. So I would recommend that if you're low on funding. So other than that, there are different kinds of considerations. Money is one thing. If you don't have any worries about money, sure, go ahead. You can just try the bigger schools. They are very expensive for ringgit Malaysia. So, but I think it also depends on which teacher you want to study from. I already had a teacher in mind when I chose my school, Professor Daniel Phillips. Um, so that's the school I went to. He was teaching in two schools, one more expensive, the other one less expensive. But I know what I'm getting. I'm getting the same. I'm basically getting the same amount of education, paying less than half the money that I have to pay in the other school. So it's a no-brainer. Of course, I'll choose. I'll choose the cheaper school with the same teacher or the same group of teachers. So yeah. So there's no one answer to that. It really depends on what you're looking for. People who are more focusing on the intense, concert and competition circuit, maybe if they're young enough, they could try Curtis. If they're good enough, they can get in. Juilliard, Manhattan, they all have very different focus. So it really depends on what you're looking for. Yeah, that's my answer for it.
Okay, now let's move on to the YouTube question. We have a question from YouTube by Andrew Basclef. Improvisation classical is a bit of out of genre, as classical music is renowned for its rigidity, structure, and symphony. So, moving away from classical training, how does one evolve towards improvisation?
I think by doing it, by just diving into the pool, and
Can
also
I can
listening.
yeah.
Any of you?
Well, so I was gonna say, yeah, to kind of follow up with that.
Mhm.
I think it's safe to say that the majority of classical music composers that we think of were improvisers. Okay, I might be wrong about some of them, and I don't even necessarily mean that they wanted to play solos all the time, but I believe that improvisation is a big part of the compositional process for lots of composers, lots of people. And the way that I think about it, and I tell some of my students this, I'm sure there's some of you guys that either currently or you grew up playing with Legos. Okay, I have a 5-year-old son. He's starting to get into this. If you buy a Lego set, let's say you buy a set to make a truck or an airplane or a boat or something, and you have all of these pieces and you have the instructions and you follow the instructions and then you put together this really nice looking boat or car or helicopter or whatever. Well, that's great. But you know what? Probably a lot of you also, after you had built that, took them apart and took the pieces apart and you use them to build something else. And that's kind of how I think about improvisation. When I tell my students when we're learning a scale, I say, okay, I've taught you how to play this scale up and down. You have the fingerings, you have the road map. Okay? But now, instead of thinking about the scale as just being one thing, we're going to take it apart. And now any of these notes you can choose from. These are all possibilities. And you can recreate not necessarily the scale, but you can create so many different things out of this scale. So I think that's a really good starting place.
Okay, another question from by Chua. Hello, thank you for the broadcast. My question is, how do we find a low stress, mistakes welcome environment to learn improvisation for beginners?
Come to our workshop.
I see.
And actually, there are no mistakes. That word
Yeah.
fascinating.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, one way you can get, as part, you've created a musical community with the orchestra. And so many other musicians. You can just get together with one or two other people. And as I think Jeremy was describing, one person plays a drone, and the other two people can then have a conversation, exchanging little bits of melodic ideas. And then the person with the drone can make the drone more rhythmic. And you can just build, like with the Lego set, you can just build, just getting together and just playing music together in groups of 1, 2, 3, 4, whoever, just with friends, just part of hanging out. Then you can listen to a tune. If there's a pop tune or something that you like, you can sort of figure out how to sing it or solfege it if you guys study solfege. And then you can take that and you can begin to play that tune or play something like the tune, and you just grow from there. It's a continuous process. We're always learning, all of us. And it's, it starts with the most simple thing in that way.
All right. So a question by Andrew Besclef again. Sounds like improvisation classical is conceptually as jazz. So how can one jam so that each strings synchronize with one another without clashing? Because scales and arpeggios of each instrument is different.
I can answer this one, and if you guys want to follow up, you can.
Yeah, sure.
So that's a great question. I think what's important is not the fact that scales and arpeggios for each instrument are different. I mean, that's of course true, but what we would focus on, I think, is instead maybe starting by picking a common key to improvise in. So let's say if you're with a group of string players, start with a key that is well suited to string instruments, G major or C major, something like that. If you're playing in the same key together, and this is one thing that we talk about at the very beginning of most of our improvisation workshops, is the relationship between scales and keys and chords. And I think, as Gregor said earlier on, is a lot of this is training your ear to understand certain things. And I think we all, just from growing up listening to music, even I'd say most of my non-musician friends understand things like what a major key sounds like, what a minor key sounds like. We understand these things intuitively a lot of times. We understand them with our ear, and so a lot of it is just starting to put labels to things that maybe we already understand. So figuring out how these chords work together, how these scales work together. Once you have a common key, let's say, and you have a collection of notes that will work well with each other, then I think the next step is to maybe make sure everybody knows what their role is in a group. So for example, if you have 10 people and they're all playing solos at once, well, even if they're all in the same key, it's probably not going to sound very clear. So improvisation also, I think, doesn't mean just playing a solo. It could also mean playing some chords as an accompaniment. Sorry, I'm playing my air cello here. Chords as an accompaniment where you improvise with the rhythmic patterns and you change the rhythmic patterns or you change the harmonies. So yeah, talking about, in chamber music, often there's different roles happening, right? Violins may be playing melodies, cellos might be playing bass lines, viola and second violin might be doing inner voice accompaniment stuff, and sometimes those roles change. But when you're improvising, a lot of those roles are very similar to chamber music. They just might be something that you find out in the moment or that you listen for spontaneously rather than having it pre-planned.
Right, for the last question for tonight, may I know how often do you all manage to get together to practice, and each time for how long? How long roughly during this time of COVID-19 lockdown? How do you guys solve the problem of getting together to practice?
Well, that's right now.
We have not solved it, I think.
That we get this weekend. It's the first time that we get together and that we are allowed to get together. And it was a really rough time. So, but before that, normally we get together a few days and rehearse all day long. Or if we are on tour, we play all the time together, stuff like that. But with the COVID-19 problem, nobody was prepared for that, and you know, it was a hard time. So we have to gear up again now.
Yeah, there's no real solution to this for now. But one thing we know is that we are all the four of us are healthy, and we're not sick or anything. So if we really need to get together, we can. For example, this Saturday we're getting together to do some work. But yeah, of course, it's not going to be very frequent.
All right.
Th-
Okay.
now is a
Sure, sure.
good time to be listening to music.
So that's what
Explore
I do.
different types of music. Go on YouTube and just go to something you've never listened to. Find something you've never heard before. Listen to it. Then look at things that are on that little. If you like this, you'll like that, and pick out random things. There's a million things to explore, and now's the time to do that. Now's the time where you can listen and kind of figure out. And you can use that close listening, not just like while you're doing the dishes kind of listening, but actually figuring out what's going on in the music, how it's organized, maybe try and sing whatever it is. These are like really excellent ways of understanding music, and they're all available even when we're in lockdown like this.
Okay. All right, everyone. We have come to the end of tonight's broadcast. For those waiting for your question to be answered, please stay after this because the question will be answered in writings. For more info, please go to our JPO Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Instagram page and press the like and follow button. If you want to rewatch and listen to this broadcast again, it will be available after this broadcast ended. The recorded live broadcast will be available for you to watch at our YouTube page. You guys have been great. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed the broadcast. That's it for tonight. Be safe, stay safe, and be healthy, and always stay at home. I will lead the prayer for tonight's program, and I will be praying in Muslim prayers, and you may pray in whatever faith you believe in for the COVID-19. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma inni a'udzubika minal barsi wal junani wal yuzami wa min sayyil asqam. Oh Allah, I seek your refuge from leprosy, insanity, mutilation, and from all serious illness. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. La yadhuru ma'ismi shay'un fil ardi wa ma fis sama'i wa ma huwa Shami'ul Alim. In the name of Allah, with whose name nothing on the earth or in the heaven can cause harm, and He is the all-hearing and the all-knowing. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina azabannar. Wassallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. All right. Thank you again, Sirius Quartet. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you so much, Chen
Thank
Hui, Gregor,
Thank you.
Ron, and Jeremy. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. It's a
Appreciate it.
pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure also.